But I really cherish the Dave Lovick and I and a number of young sailors. We wanted to learn the sea channels. We wanted to learn rudder shapes. We wanted to learn every designer's name. We wanted to be able to look. I can look at it and say that's Hirschoff. I can look at that and say that's S&S. I can look at that and say that's Alden. Just like you can look at a car and say it's a Chevy and that's a Porsche. they're completely distinctive. Each guy has their own bow shapes and.
But you don't see those boats too much.
Well, that's true. Now you say Bavaria and Bedito. But anyway, that type of thing was so thrilling, to feel that you were part of this long historical culture, that was going on, was absolutely wonderful. And our sense of being sea gypsies was totally being outside, There was no, in the 1950s, there was no marinas. There wasn't any option to be a marina. And we were always with fishermen. We were always with, the local guys. And I think my childhood was absolutely incredible.
And you didn't depend on the Coast Guard to come rescue you
No,
or anything.
no.
There were.
And our boat, the Elizabeth, was built in 1924. She was designed by John G. Alden. She was built by Morse Brothers in Thomaston, Maine. My first boat was William Atkins, built in 1932 out of Port Oxford Cedar on the west coast. And then Carolyn and I, now get this, in 1971, I was so enthralled, of course, with Slocum. I wanted to build I told Carolyn, I said, I'd like to have a bigger boat, a better boat. She said, well, can we buy one? I was like, no, they're very expensive. She's like, well, why don't you build one? Now, she's talking to a 19-year-old kid.
We were 19.
We were 19. And I said, well, honey, it's really difficult to build a boat, I don't know if you realize.
But your brother-in-law had already built a boat.
Well, I'd already been involved in a number of boat building projects. That's why I knew it was so damn difficult. And she said, she looked at me with those big Italian eyes and said, Patty, you can do that. And of course, well, yeah, I can do it, sure. And so we decided to go to Boston because Slocum had Boston on his transom. And so, okay, so we go to Boston. That's how I was making decisions in those days.
He did it there.
Yeah, exactly. He did it there. I'm going to.
Point of reference. It's a good place to start, right?
Sure. So we went to Boston, and we found out that we're trying to find a person to split, a small building space with, and it was kind of difficult. So suddenly I realized, wait a minute. So I rented a huge warehouse. That you could. We ended up building 6 boats, forming a commune, and building 6 boats in this warehouse.
And everybody built their own.
Yeah, everybody built their own boat, but and then I realized I couldn't afford an apartment in Boston, so I rented an apartment complex. Anyway, to make a long story short, after 3 years, we splashed a boat. We lived on it for 18 years. We sailed it across oceans. We had a perfect little.
What was the name of this one?
The name of that one was Carlotta. She was built out of ferro-cement. And Endurance 35. And Carolyn got a book out of the library. We're sitting in this big warehouse. It's 700 feet long warehouse. It's just completely empty. And Carolyn's sitting there in the lotus position. And she goes to the library and gets a book on loftings. It was Howard Chappell's Practical Loftings? How to Loft a Boat? Anyway, it was something, And so she's reading the thing and I'm saying, well, come on, how do we do it? And she's like, she looks at me and she's like, oh, you're right, it is complicated. And and a few years later, here was this 20,000-pound object,
all we got was we bought plans from
$25. Yeah, it's like
$25.
close cover
numbers.
before you striking.
Yeah, but it was just numbers. It was just sheets of numbers.
Just sheets
and
of numbers.
We
Like, what are those?
Full-size drawing of every station frame.
Yeah.
And this commune that we formed. Had many people out that had jobs and cars and trucks and houses and had all the stuff, and I had none of that. And I thought that I would sit at these people's feet and being a 19-year-old, learn from them. As it turned out, they were kind of so overwhelmed by the task that none of those boats really saw the water. One saw the water eventually, 15 years later, and I realized that with Carolyn's help, I could do anything, pretty much. You know what I mean? And that's not an egotistical thought, and it's not a thought that I know how to do this, but, we could figure it out. We could muddle it. She's got brains, I got brawn. We can do this, And that gave me a tremendous sense of confidence. So at 23, we sailed out of Boston, full of it, and And I was already, very interested in writing. And on one side of the tool room, one side of the forecastle, I had a tool room, and on the starboard side, I had a complete dark room, so I could develop my prints as I took, as I wrote. And that was pretty cool. That was in 1970.
That's another big up is digital.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. I mean, imagine not only having rolls of film and developing those rolls of film, but imagine then going up and printing them in the tropics and all the chemicals.
Each shot just matters
so
much.
much.
It's
Yeah.
not just like,
No,
Yeah.
it's like, I better get this right.
So
yeah, he found he worked for a publication that was a pretty marginal publication, and they gave him one roll of film or two.
2 rolls of film, and I was like, wait a minute, you expect me to shoot the whole regatta? No, I said, you expect me to shoot just 2 rolls of film all day? And they were like, no, that's the whole regatta.
It was like a 4-day regatta.
How many pictures were per?
36.
36.
36.
Yeah. And
This is a big roll.
so
Yeah.
so in those days, it was a totally different thing. And so then we're sailing along, and we're now under sail for many, many years. And then Carolyn comes to me and says, why don't we change the forecastle? I was like, why? The tool room's perfect, and the dark room, we're using that all the time. She said, well, why don't we put a little bunk up there? I said, what good would a bunk be? It could only be 4 feet, 9 months later, Roma was born. And she enriched, the only thing better that I've ever done than being raised aboard a 52-foot schooner in the 50s was to raise our daughter aboard. And it was even better than being a kid, to be a parent, to see the whole world new through her eyes. And Carolyn and I are just really blessed to have a wonderful daughter. And she's got such a great sense of humor. And she really enriched our lives. And we now, now she flies in 20 different countries. She's flown into Tahiti, and she's flying into Cape Town, and so she's always visiting us. Matter of fact, she flew into Durban 20 years ago to see us. So that's really cool, and that type of continuity that all good. My sister Carol says, she just did an interview, and she says, in times of emergency, in times of trouble, in times of distress, Goodlanders build boats, and we always figure, give me a Swiss Army knife, God damn it, and a tree, and I'll sail out of here,
During this whole time, you were self-funding, right? I mean, you
absolutely.
worked. So how did you manage that? Did you work? Some people binge work and then they go and take years off. Some people tend to work a few hours a day and then kind of balance it. What do you do?
I always knew that in order to be free, you have to sign your own paycheck. And so that was an important thing to me. Now, Carolyn's worked at many different jobs, and I've occasionally worked, but my goal was always to self-fund myself, and I always wanted to be a writer.
But you used to work in marine stores a lot when we were building boats.
And because I could get the discount, right? And I worked for wholesalers for the same reason. But I knew that I wanted to be a writer, but I'd only went for school for these 5 years, that was a little daunting, and they convinced me that I couldn't be a writer, and so I decided to be a songwriter. But I didn't have Mick Jagger's lips. I wanted those big lips, or Bob Dylan's nose. I didn't have a good nose. Anyway, when I wrote songs for years and performed, and I still have music, but I didn't make jack shit. I mean, I got lots of free booze, but during that time span, I realized I could be a writer, and completely concentrated on that. And I decided to get serious when Roma was born. She's now 35 or something. When Roma was born, I decided to get really serious about my writing, and so I decided to write, every day for a long span of time. So I would buy a ream of paper, right? And I think it was $5.70 at the time, and I would do that. And then I would work on these sheets of paper as hard as I possibly could, typing it out with a manual typewriter, until 3 months later, right? The hardest I've ever worked, the most physically and psychologically stressful I'd ever worked, and I'd realized at the end of that period that I had ruined the value of those pieces of paper. That they had been worth $5.70. Now they were worth shit, right? And I'd go and can we afford another ream of paper? And I'd go and buy another one and do that again and again and again. And I finally.
How many books have you written at this point then?
I've written about 14 books that I've published. I've written many more than that.
But then you haven't published.
Yeah, yeah. And the wisest thing I could do
Yeah.
is sometimes just take the whole
They're
manuscript
on
and
some hard drive
throw
somewhere.
throw it in the wastepaper basket. But the writing has been incredibly good for me. And
But you got paid with peanuts one time.
yeah, well, I was first
Literally.
I was first, and this guy says, I said, "Where's my money?" He says, "We don't have any money." I said, "What do you mean you don't have any money?" I said, "I got to eat." He's like, "Well, there's a grocer that owes the newspaper money." So I go into the grocery store, and you owe us money, and the guy said, "Well, I don't have anything." I'm like, so I looked around and there was peanuts, and I'm like, taking these peanuts, I'm taking these
No, he
peanuts.
tells me
So I bring her, bring her
credit.
home. And Carolyn
So,
says,
did you
gee, they're paying you in peanuts. That's bad. So next week, it was a fish wholesaler. I bring fish. It's just like, oh my God, it's dead fish.
Paying you in that business.
Yeah, but you're eating.
Yeah. And it's very difficult. The writing game is a very difficult one, but it's a beautiful one because I used to be an actor. And when I was an actor, and when I stepped on that stage, even if I was alone, there was so much that went into it. Lighting and a set and it really was 25 people that went on stage with me. And yet a writer, requires nothing. I am God of the universe of that page. You know what I mean? It's solely me. I don't have to share credit. I take all the blame and the responsibility, and I get all the credit. Now, it's very difficult to make your writing, and I was explaining to you before, how do you convince Cruising World magazine to pay you thousands of dollars per article when they started out paying you 40? And they have thousands of submissions every month that will be happy to be published for $40. But my feeling is simply this. You guys are successful because people watch your videos. There's no middleman. You know what I mean? You don't have to convince the theater to show your films. That's a whole different story. You don't have to, you've got directly to your customer. And my idea was that the editor was somebody that I had to, somehow get around.
Yeah.
I had to be nice enough and legitimate enough and professional enough for him to accept me, but yet go around him to get to the readers. The reason that I'm a high-paid writer in my realm is because every month they get more positive letters about me than they've ever had about any other writer, and the reason for that is because I just tell them the truth. I mean, that's it. I mean, that's there's like, what is the secret?
You're passionate about what you
Just,
write.
yeah, and just tell them the truth. And when you, tell them, just tell them the
So
truth.
about your catalog work.
Yeah, and I do all sorts of things. And people, I've had rejection letters. Like one time, the guy said, trees have to die so you can write this stuff. Oh my God, that's a pretty bad one. And they said, one reader said, I read your manuscript, it's the worst manuscript I've ever read. So I sent him another one, so I didn't think I was discouraged. He said, wait a minute, I have to revise my statement on the previous one.
This is the worst.
And then, I'm at my sister's, and I read a review of my book, and it's a very bad review, and I'm so mad. I don't want my sister to see me cry, so I go into the bathroom, I whip out my pen, I say, "Sir, I've just read your review. I have your review in front of me, and I'm soon going to put it behind me."
Critics are a very good sign you're on the right path.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
but I think you get way more positive comments than negative ones. I know
Sure.
we get some off-the-wall weird comments,
Yeah.
and everybody does, but
Yeah.
the positive way outweighs
Sure.
the negative.
Sure. And I think that in my case, I think that a lot of writers become writers, because they want to be universally loved. Well, of course you can't be universally loved. But I would like to think that people are inspired to achieve their dreams. When Roma was born, I thought to myself, I don't want this child to be necessarily a sailor, and I don't want her to necessarily be a writer. I never want to measure her by those two skills. But I wanted her to give those skills that will allow her to obtain her goals, And I think we did that, and I think that that's a really cool.
You can read more on Cap and Fatty at fattygoodlander.com or do an author search on Goodlander, and that's FATTY, not fat with a PH.
Worked for Big Tobacco, and Bull Durham in those days was the biggest tobacco company, and he drew the bull. And he gradually started to draw the bull with a larger and larger piece of male artillery. And he would show us the pictures, and we'd say, "Oh no, Dad, please don't send him that way." And finally, Bull Durham started getting all these letters of complaint, and asked him about it. And he came back to the boat and said, "We're going. I'm no longer a lackey of big tobacco. I'm out. And
Yeah.
when they told me that, he used to tell me that he was in harness to big tobacco, and when we were sailing off, we would escape the rat race, and I saw some team of horses at some point in my life when I was maybe 6, and I said, what about this? And they said, well, they're in harness. Those horses, see, here's the harnesses. And I realized, oh my God, he was in harness to big tobacco, and he had rats, and they put harnesses on him, and he had to race, and that was my vision of corporate America.